Hi everyone, today we are going to do my wrap up of what I read in June. I had a fairly ambitious TBR for June and I got through a lot of it, but I also went solidly off book for a chunk of the month. So there are plenty of books on here that were not part of my TBR. Some of them were books that I had out from the library and wanted to finish, and others I just kind of felt like reading. I also started having a bit of a science fiction slump this month. I had a bunch of science fiction books because of my Hugo Awards reading project, and I wasn't enjoying them that much. So I got a little burned out on science fiction. I'm still dealing with that, but I will be done with the project soon, and I don't know where I was going with that. So early in the month, I read The 10,000 Doors of January by Alix E. Harrow. This was one of the Hugo Awards finalists for Best Novel. I had my doubts going into this book just because of the way it was described. It seemed like it was going to be a book kind of about the magic of reading, and I'm a little cynical about things like that. They can be a little self-indulgent from the author, and I have a review up of this. Overall, I quite liked it. I thought it was a good debut. I thought it was well written. There were a lot of good things about it, but yeah, the parts of the book that had to do with the main character's love of reading and just the number of different tropes and ideas that were thrown into this relatively short book meant that I didn't love it, but it was really good. I mean, I thought it was fine. I enjoyed it. I am definitely planning to read the author's next book, which I think is coming out later this year, and I think it's supposed to be about witches in the early suffragette movement, which sounds really cool. The next book I read was not on my TBR. It was called The Winds of Marque by Bennett R. Coles. It was sort of a naval science fiction, if that makes sense. There were ships in space that had sails for some reason. No, it was explained in the book, I just don't remember the science behind it. It was kind of a master and commander in space. There was politics, aristocrats, pirates, intrigue. It was pretty good fun. I think from what I remember, the author is a former member of the Navy, so he definitely has an excellent working knowledge of how that structure works, even though this was a fictional Navy. And overall, I enjoyed it. It was a pretty quick, light read. It was the first book in a series. I'm not rushing out to pick up the next book in the series, but I'd probably continue it. It's a style of fiction that I definitely have a soft spot for. The next thing I read was Rosewater by Tade Thompson. I have a review up for this as well. This was one of the science fiction books that just didn't work out that well for me. There's a lot in it to admire. Super interesting book. Feel free to check out the review if you want to know more about that. Another science fiction book that I read, this time by choice, was Driving in the Deep by Suzanne Palmer. This is the sequel to Finder, so it's the second book in her Finder series, which is about Fergus Ferguson, an intergalactic repo man, basically, who goes around basically finding things and getting into a lot of trouble and somehow getting himself out of it. I was really surprised by how much I liked Finder. That's the first book in the series, so I had higher expectations for this one. It's basically a typical, I guess I would call it sort of a detective adventure style book where you have a core cast of characters or core character who goes around and is in different situations in each book and dealing with a different thing. So I had higher expectations from this book, which meant that I wasn't able to be quite so pleasantly surprised by it as I was by the first one, but I still really enjoyed it. I thought that the characters were very likable. I was definitely excited by it and wanted to see what would happen. It kept me reading. Basically, it was everything that I wanted it to be, so I really hope that she continues with this series. Then I completely diverged from the TBR again, and I read The Giver of Stars by JoJo Moyes. This is the first book I've read by JoJo Moyes, and she wasn't an author I necessarily thought I would ever read. But this one had an interesting premise, and I was also reading it with a friend, and she picked the book, and I went along with it. It's set in the rural South in the 1930s, where an English woman has married a local and moved there, and she becomes basically a traveling local librarian as part of an initiative that was started at the time to help increase literacy and education among the rural community. It deals a lot with social issues as well as her really terrible marriage and sort of the life issues of many of the other characters. It was basically what I expected it to be. There were a lot of things about it I liked. There was an antagonist who was so cartoonishly villainous that I just really couldn't take that seriously at all. But overall, as a sort of women-oriented historical fiction, I thought it was a pretty nice book. There were some things in it that are cliche to historical fiction of that type that I've read enough of it that it kind of drives me crazy. Like, there's always the woman that gets into a marriage naively and then realizes that the husband he's always either gay or having an affair or both, or just not interested in her for some reason. Like, it's just the same, it's always the same situation. And I don't know why this is such a trope in historical fiction, but I read so many books with that setup in my teens that I am just kind of over the scenario. That being said, I thought the historical information and the stuff about the traveling libraries, that was really, really interesting. And there was a lot about the book that I did enjoy. I thought the characters were really likable. You did care about what happened to them. I don't have a ton of experience with the South myself, and the book was written by someone who's English, so I really have no idea how authentic she was to the South of the 1930s, but I know she definitely did her research. For some reason, the next book I read was also historical fiction set in the Great Depression era. This was This Tender Land by William Kent Krueger, an author I had not heard of before and still know nothing about. I think he has a very popular detective series that I have not read. I can't even remember how I found this book from the library. I actually really, really liked it. It's kind of an Odyssey type story. It's historical, but there are elements about it that sort of verge on the fantastical. That's not dominating the story, but it's kind of in there. It tells the story of two brothers who have been orphaned and sent to live at a school that was established to re-educate Native American children. This is something that used to happen that was really, really terrible. They would be taken away from their families and stripped of their own culture and basically educated in not very good situations. In this book, and I think it's pretty true to life, they were basically being used as free labor for the people at and around the school rather than really receiving any kind of education. So the narrator and his older brother are actually the only white children at the school. It's a kind of weird scenario how they've ended up there. They end up escaping from the absolutely awful lady that runs the school and is very abusive to them, and they take along their best friend, who is mute, and he is Sue, and they also take along a little girl who has been recently orphaned, and so these four kids make their way down the Mississippi. So it's very much a Odyssey type story. There's a long journey. They encounter all sorts of people and perils, and really these kids that have been raised in this terrible situation kind of need to figure out what they want to do with themselves, but also who to even trust, because they haven't really had anyone good in their life, pretty much. So I had no expectations of this book at all, but I actually really liked it. After that, I read another science fiction book, The Light Brigade by Kameron Hurley. I just posted up a review of this if you want to know my thoughts. It was another science fiction that I thought was very interesting. I see why it was nominated for the best novel for the Hugo Awards. I didn't totally love it. I just maybe I'm still not really in a science fiction mood right now, and again, it was a little bit dark. It was sort of about the horrors of war. So really good book, just not something I was in the mood for. This month, I was also listening to The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern on audiobook. This is a book that I had heard a lot about on BookTube, both good and bad, so I really didn't know how I was going to react to it, and I think pretty much a lot of what I heard about it, both good and bad, is true. It was an interesting one to listen to on audiobook because it's very atmospheric, and the way they did the audiobook was quite nice. There were multiple narrators because there are different story threads and interludes. It's a very nested book with a couple different narratives. I actually thought that The Starless Sea did everything that the 10,000 Doors of January was trying to do even better. So even though it was also kind of a self-indulgent book about the power of reading, I liked it a lot more, and I really enjoyed being immersed in it. I didn't necessarily think it was an amazing book. I don't think it's something I would strongly recommend, but I generally enjoyed spending time in that world. It was nice. I don't think it's something I'm going to go back to. It's not going to be a favorite, but for what it was trying to do, I think it did it pretty well. The last science fiction book for the Hugo Awards that I read in June was Planetfall by Emma Newman. So I went into it just really wanting it to be different than some of the other science fiction I'd been reading. I don't know what I was hoping for. I was just already sick of science fiction. And you know, I got my wish. This one was more of a sort of dark psychological thriller with an unreliable narrator. I got through it so fast because I was dying to know what happened. It definitely was a little bit disturbing in the end, but overall I liked it. I'll have a review up for it soon. The rest of the books in the quartet are supposed to be only loosely connected, so I'm kind of curious to see how they relate, because it's hard to see how anything could really connect based on the way Planetfall ended. But yeah, that's one more off the list for the Hugo Awards Best Series list, so I'm almost through that. I only have a few more to go next month. I also read Mistborn 1, which I really enjoyed. I think I honestly spent most of the month reading it very slowly because I just really wanted to take it in. I'm looking forward to doing a review for Mistborn pretty soon as well. I kind of need to gather my thoughts. It's a little different doing a review of a reread, especially a book that I've read quite a few times, but it was really nice coming back to this at a little bit of an older age and trying to remember what it was like the first time I read it and thinking about what I appreciate more about it now. So I still very much enjoyed this book, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the trilogy this month. I also started Luna New Moon by Ian McDonald, another science fiction from the best series list. I was planning to read it in June. It was on my TBR. I started it and then just honestly was not very into it, and I'm still trying to get through it, but I took a break and read a few other things in between, so I'll probably finish it up soon. It just was not what I was really in the mood for. I also, just at the end of June, started Discount Armageddon by Seanan McGuire from the Encrypted series, which has been pretty good fun so far. I'm not all that far into it, but I'm definitely going to finish that pretty early in July, so I'm looking forward to that. So that is everything that I read in June. I did get through a pretty decent portion of my TBR, but I need to do a little bit better in July if I actually want to finish everything for all these projects I have going on. So wish me luck. Still a few science fiction books to go. I'm not trying to be down on science fiction. I genuinely like science fiction. It's just usually maybe 5 to 10% of what I read, not like 80%. So it's been a little tiring. But I think I read some really good books this month overall. There weren't too many surprises. I think I basically liked the books I thought I would like and was neutral on or disliked the books that I didn't think I would be into. So it's always nice to get surprises. Hopefully something in July will be like a nice surprise, a new favorite, something like that. So let me know down in the comments what your favorite books in June were, and please like this video and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me.